just want you to remember this picture because I'm going to refer back to it in a minute, and I didn't have the foresight to actually put it in the presentation at the right place. So remember that setup of a nymph, so a young Tropilaelaps mite coming out of a cell, because I'll talk about it in a minute. Like Leslie said, I've been working on Tropilaelaps since probably about 2022, and interest has been growing in the subject since 2024. So Tropilaelaps was found on mainland Europe in Western Russia and Georgia in 2024, and there's been another sort of series of kind of events that's happened that I would like to sort of discuss with you today. But it's kind of, I'm still quite surprised by the number of beekeepers that actually don't know that much about Tropilaelaps and don't know what it is. So if you've heard me speak before, and I've covered this before, bear with me. But for those of you that don't know about Tropilaelaps, some basics first. So they are an ectoparasite that naturally infests and reproduce in honeybee brood. They are native to Southeast Asia, and they naturally infest the giant honeybee species. So that's Apis dorsata and Apis laboriosa. So our western honeybees, Apis mellifera, are not native to Asia. So Apis mellifera is native to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And we imported western honeybees into Asia and other countries around the world, probably the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Nobody's exactly sure when it happened, but at some point, Varroa jumped species from Apis cerana, which is the eastern honeybee, and Tropilaelaps jumped species from these giant honeybee species to infest our western honeybees. So there's 4 subspecies of Tropilaelaps, but only one of those is actually kind of causing problems and has spread. This is Tropilaelaps mercedesi, so that's what's present in Europe at the moment. When I refer to Tropilaelaps in this talk, I'm talking about Tropilaelaps mercedesi. They're a third the size of Varroa, 1 millimetre long by about 0.5 millimetre wide. And why are Tropilaelaps a problem? That's kind of why we're all here and what you want to hear about that. So one of the main things is the way that Tropilaelaps reproduce is, so it's similar to Varroa in that a foundress female mite will go into a cell, she'll lay a series of eggs in that cell, that egg hatches, goes through a series of molts until it's a mature adult mite, and then those mites then go on to reproduce themselves. But the main differences are that the rate of reproduction of Tropilaelaps is much faster, so the time from egg to actual adult is much shorter. The Tropilaelaps female mites can lay more eggs, and I think one of the big differences is that whereas with Varroa mites, they actually need to be able to feed on the adult bees in between reproductive cycles to be able to produce eggs. So a Varroa mite will typically spend between 5 and 7 days outside of the brood on the adult bees. Tropilaelaps don't need to do that, so they can very quickly get back into a cell and reproduce. So at the start of the talk, I said, remember that picture with the nymphs? So one other thing, I've done a lot of work this summer looking at Tropilaelaps mites, and one of the things that we're kind of realising now, so I get asked a lot about how will Varroa sensitive behaviour, how will that affect Tropilaelaps? Will these bees that have developed resistance to Varroa, will they be able to combat Tropilaelaps? And so, I mean, this is purely observational. We do have some data which we're going to look at, but currently when you see reproduction on the scale of this, what we're finding is that potentially, so it's either one of 2 scenarios or it might be a combination of the 2. So we think that the Tropilaelaps mites might actually be able to lay eggs before the cells are sealed, and so you have a female that lays eggs in perhaps an 8-day-old larvae and then hops into another cell and lays eggs. Or bees that exhibit this hygienic behaviour where they uncap brood are actually releasing the mites earlier, so the foundress mites can continue to reproduce. And what we've looked at is, does that uncapping and recapping behaviour, does that impact their reproduction and stop the nymphs from developing? And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to do that. So that very first picture I showed you was brood that we'd purposefully uncapped, and we monitored the nymphs to see how they survived. Did that Varroa sensitive behaviour affect them? And you can see from that first picture, the nymphs were actually quite happy. So the work we need to do is to see if they can then go on to reproduce. But it's a question I get asked a lot, and I think it's purely observational, but I think it's concerning what I've seen this year. So another issue with Tropilaelaps is the way that the Tropilaelaps mites feed and the way that sort of damage exhibits itself in the colony. So with a Varroa mite, your foundress female mite will go into a cell. She'll set up a feeding site. She has piercing mouth parts, so she makes quite a clean feeding site on that prepupae, and then all of her offspring will feed from that feeding site. So it's quite a sort of neat feeding process. So this picture here, you should be able to see that there's lots of brown dots on this prepupae, and those are wounds that are caused by Tropilaelaps feeding. So you can see that there are multiple wounds caused to that brood. Now, if this doesn't kill the brood, which very often it does, those wounds then go on to develop as scars and deformities, and you'll see that this bee here, that's perhaps not the easiest, but you can see that there are scars on the abdomen that were caused by that feeding process. You'll also see deformities in the feet, in the antennae, and of course this bee obviously has deformed wings, so Tropilaelaps also vectors viruses, which is another issue. One of the other issues, as if we haven't kind of already hit enough issues, is seeing the damage that's caused within a colony. So something that continually surprises me. So this colony has very high levels of Tropilaelaps infestation, and you can see the damage to the brood there. So I've kind of highlighted the brood cells that have died there. But something that continually surprises me when I look at Tropilaelaps is I will go through colonies, and you'll see some of the videos of infested colonies later on in this, and the brood looks very healthy and the bees look very healthy. And as a beekeeper, I go through and I go like, okay, this looks okay, this isn't too bad. And it's not until you start actually investigating the brood and looking for the mites specifically that you realise that the infestation level is very high. And the colony goes from the point of infestation to the point of collapse very quickly. Beekeepers in Asia and in Georgia now are reporting without treatment, you're looking at between 3 and 6 months for a colony to collapse. Whereas with Varroa, you've got potentially sort of 2 years without treatment, and that colony will survive. And that's another issue in terms of breeding resistant stocks, because you've got that very short window where the colony collapses. It's very difficult to then breed any sort of successful survivor instincts for those colonies. So quickly, I'll talk about distribution. So this map in blue, it shows the distribution of the giant honeybee species. So we have the giant Asian honeybee, Apis dorsata, and we have the giant Himalayan honeybee, Apis laboriosa. That comes from the Himalayas, unsurprisingly. Tropilaelaps infests those two species of honeybee. So therefore, this dark blue is the area of natural distribution of Tropilaelaps mercedesi as well. So I really like the giant honeybees. I think they're really interesting, and it's really important to know about the giant honeybee biology, because Tropilaelaps naturally infests them, and that can then inform the research that we do. So this is Apis dorsata, the giant Asian honeybee in Thailand. They're a really cool bee, like I said. So they nest out in the open. They build these large single combs high up on trees and buildings and on the side of cliffs. You can see this tree here. There's multiple nests in this tree, and they'll all be related to one another. So there'll be sort of mother-daughter colonies, sister colonies, and there's me at the bottom of that tree to give you an idea of scale. Like, it's a really impressive sight to see, and these colonies are really huge. Now, a lot of the time, beekeepers will say to me, if Tropilaelaps gets to the UK, it won't really be an issue. Our winters are cold, we have broodless periods throughout the winter, and that will stop Tropilaelaps from reproducing. So there's a number of issues with that statement, which I will sort of cover. But the main one that I want to cover now is that part of the natural cycle of Apis dorsata and Apis laboriosa is that these are migratory bees. So this is a paper by Robinson from 2021. I would highly recommend reading it. There's a QR code there if you want to go and read that. And he looked at, amongst other things, the migration of Apis dorsata from Chiang Mai, which is in Thailand, up into the mountains of Pai, which is sort of also in Thailand. It's about 130 kilometers. So in Thailand, you have a dry season, and the bees will nest down in the lowlands, and then when the rainy season comes, they migrate to find food. And when they do this migration, they do what's called bivouacking. So you can see these are bivouacs of Apis dorsata, and they hang up in the trees, and they don't produce any comb, they don't produce any brood, and they do this for several weeks, sometimes several months at a time. So the natural host of Tropilaelaps actually has these natural broodless periods. Apis dorsata and Apis laboriosa, they're not very well researched. I mean, they nest at the top of cliffs, so it's quite hard to actually get there and research them. So nobody really knows what Tropilaelaps is doing, but they have evolved or co-evolved with these bees to have some sort of natural way of surviving broodless periods, which we don't understand at the moment. So I started talking about Tropilaelaps and giving presentations in 2022, and I put together a version of this map. And at that time, this was the current sort of scientific knowledge on where Tropilaelaps was confirmed and reported. The thing that shocked me, though, is that I've had to keep on updating this map, sometimes several times a year. So 2024, Tropilaelaps was confirmed in Uzbekistan, and then in the Krasnodar and Rostov regions of Western Russia, so that's on the Black Sea there. And then after that, it was in Georgia. And then this year, so this report was put out by the European Union Reference Laboratory, and it talks of 2 unconfirmed reports of Tropilaelaps in Crimea and in Belarus. But I think the fact that EURL has put that out kind of suggests that it's probably quite a credible unconfirmed report. And what I find very concerning about this report is that the actual research was undertaken in 2023, and it's taken until 2025 for that to actually be kind of become apparent sort of within research circles. The other thing that worries me, so if you read the text, and again there's a QR code there, it seems like there were quite high levels of Tropilaelaps infestation, and it's very hard to get any information. So was it actually Tropilaelaps? You know, because it is unconfirmed. If it was Tropilaelaps, did it manage to establish? Has it spread? How far has it spread? And there's just this black hole of information. And so, you know, certainly we're looking at, we've got Poland here, we've got other countries very close by that have very big beekeeping communities. And if it's taken 2 years to kind of get this information out, then what's going on? What don't we know about? So very concerning. So one of the questions I've been interested in and my team has been interested in is how can Tropilaelaps spread, and particularly how can it reach the UK? Like, what are we looking at? What threats do we pose? So obviously, migratory beekeeping, the large portion of that spread across Asia has been beekeepers moving colonies infested with Tropilaelaps and just moving them around, and that's spread it. But, you know, we wanted to look at and understand the potential for spread in other things. So back in 2022, the scientific understanding was that Tropilaelaps could not survive for longer than 72 hours, so 3 days, on anything other than fresh, live honeybee brood. So in theory, it was highly unlikely that Tropilaelaps could survive on things like queen imports, used beekeeping equipment, packages of bees, and honeycomb. But in 2022, and like I said, this was when I started doing the work, we had a couple of sort of incidents in the UK. So this picture shows some Apis florea, so that's the red dwarf honeybee. And this box of honey was intercepted in the UK by customs, and you've got an Apis florea red dwarf honeybee colony here, and they're like the giant honeybees, just smaller because they're dwarf honeybees. And the honey hunters go out, and so you have honey at the top and brood at the bottom, and the honey hunters will cut the brood off and then obviously put the honey in the box. So there's a reasonable chance that there was some bee brood present in this box that got imported into the UK, and therefore there's a chance that Tropilaelaps were present in that box as well. I mean, it was intercepted, but you know, it's a risk. So this is a video that was taken from Felixstowe Docks, also in 2022. You can show a fairly well-established Apis florea colony. It did, you know, the ship did manage to dock. The shipping container was sort of in the UK. You can see this colony, so the bees were alive at the time. I know it doesn't look it, but there's nothing to say that our Apis mellifera haven't perhaps robbed this colony out. We don't know whether it was infested with Tropilaelaps or not. And then literally just last week, I've been talking to USDA officials last night. So a ship was trying to dock in North America, I think it was New Jersey, and the captain of the ship radioed in that they had a honeybee colony on the ship, and what should they do? The local sort of bee inspectorate went out to deal with that. It was an Apis dorsata colony, also infested with Tropilaelaps mites. So these wild colonies of bees, I mean, fortunately, that was dealt with, it was destroyed, the ship didn't dock, so that's quite a good news story. But it kind of goes to show the issues and the ways that Tropilaelaps can be transmitted and spread around. So like I said, we wanted to know, how can Tropilaelaps be spread? So we designed this experiment, and we particularly wanted to look at queen cages, packages of bees, other bee species. So we did this last July in Chiang Mai University. They have honeybee colonies there that are infested with Tropilaelaps mites. So we harvested mites from the colonies there. We set up our different treatment groups in these plastic pots, and then the pots were kept in an incubator at 34 degrees Celsius, 60% relative humidity, and we checked the mite survival every 24 hours. So what did we find out? So we've got some results here. So perhaps not unsurprisingly, in the control group that was just an empty pot, you've got I can't really see, sort of over 80% of the mites died within 24 hours, and everything was dead by 48 hours. So they had no food, they had no shelter. It's really not that surprising. What is surprising, though, is with the mites so one of the treatment groups we looked at was Apis dorsata, so the giant honeybees. They are the natural hosts of Tropilaelaps, and we collected some live bees from the university. And what we noticed was when we introduced the mites into those pots, there was a very strong reaction from those bees. So they released a lot of alarm pheromone. They groomed themselves a lot. And you can see, so this is the blue line here. So 90-ish% of the mites were dead by 48 hours, and then everything was dead by 72 hours. And what seems to happen is because Tropilaelaps and these giant honeybee species have co-evolved, they've got these defense mechanisms such as grooming that allows them, so if you put a lot of mites on them, they weren't very happy and they groomed them off and they got rid of them. So we also looked at our western honeybees, Apis mellifera, so we had some newly emerged western honeybees, the sort that you might get in a queen cage as an attendant or in a package of bees. So they didn't do so well. So approximately 85% of the mites that we put in with the live western honeybees died within 48 hours, but there was 15% of the mites approximately that went on to survive for up to 5 days. And what we think is happening is that this small percentage of mites is potentially able to set up a feeding site. The mites did seem to kind of congregate around where the head joins the thorax, and if you look at a bee, there's sort of a membrane there which they may or may not be able to feed with, but that's sort of what we think happened. They're very small mites, it's very difficult to actually sort of see what they're doing. But we think that if the mite was able to set up a feeding site, then they could get enough nutrition to survive for up to 5 days. If they couldn't set up a feeding site, then they died quite quickly. But the interesting and sort of alarming results were, so we also looked at dead western honeybee adults and dead western honeybee brood, and on the dead brood and the dead bees, the mites survived for up to 7 and 8 days respectively. And we kept these pots in an incubator, so they decompose pretty rapidly. It's not a fun job opening a pot of decomposing bees to go and count microscopic mites. But what we think is happening is that decomposition process and the juices that get produced by that is that the mites are able to feed because things were softer and they could digest the juices, which just enamors Tropilaelaps to you even more. It's great. So from this, basically, so this was the first time that Tropilaelaps had been observed surviving on anything other than live honeybee brood. We didn't expect these results, so we were somewhat shocked. And it does kind of highlight the risks that these different commodities pose for Tropilaelaps transmission. And particularly with the young adult bees and the mite survival on there, so that hadn't been seen before. that made us ask the question, well, if they can survive on bees in a pot, what about swarms? Can Tropilaelaps be transmitted in swarms? And again, the then scientific knowledge was, no, they can't. Swarms didn't pose a threat for transmission. But we wanted to look at this. So we did this work in Georgia this summer, and we looked at natural swarms and we looked at artificial swarms as well. So first of all, we looked at natural swarms. And in a natural swarming process, so you have your colony, it prepares to swarm, so queen cells are produced, the queen is slimmed down, so the bees feed her less and they make her walk around so she loses a bit of weight so she can fly. Scout bees begin looking for a new nesting site. This whole process takes about 10 days approximately. And then the colony actually decide to swarm, so about 2/3 of the colony swarms. 70% of those bees that leave the hive are workers that are less than 10 days old. And then once they've swarmed, they'll hang up in a tree somewhere and they'll sit there and they'll send out more scout bees to look for somewhere to find a new home. And so they either find somewhere themselves, or a beekeeper comes along, sticks them in a hive, and then those worker bees begin to produce wax, begin to produce comb, and the queen will start to lay once comb is produced in those new hives. But with artificial swarms, so artificial swarms can be used to, so it's something that's sort of done by a beekeeper, and it can either be used to, you can use adapted versions to reduce Varroa levels or to treat very low levels of European foul brood. And it's something that a beekeeper does to the bees, so you move your parent colony to one side. You go into the original colony, you find that queen, you put her in a new box with foundation, and the older forager bees return to that colony. And then again, those bees go on to produce wax, build comb, and the queen will lay in that first comb. So two quite different scenarios and two quite sort of different setups in the hive. And what we wanted to look at, so we did this experiment, it was quite a small experiment, and we had one natural swarm and we had two artificial swarms that we did. So with the natural swarm first, so 8 Tropilaelaps mites were transmitted from that mother colony to the daughter colony. 4 of those mites went on to survive sort of beyond 7 days. Of those 4 mites that survived, 2 went on to successfully reproduce, and each of those 2 mites produced 3 offspring, and they did this in the very first cells that colony started to build when they were drawing wax and comb. With the artificial swarms, so the parent colonies of the artificial swarms had much higher levels of infestation than the parent colony of the natural swarm. So more Tropilaelaps mites were transmitted when we did the artificial swarm. In the first one, 23 Tropilaelaps mites were transmitted. All of those were female. In the second one, 17 Tropilaelaps mites were transmitted, 16 female and 1 male in that one. So that's the first time that a male Tropilaelaps mite has been recorded sort of being transmitted anywhere. But the main thing was that none of those mites managed to survive, none of them went on to reproduce. So why is that? What's the difference? Well, like I said when I kind of described the process, with the natural swarms, the colony prepares, so the pheromones and the volatile organic compounds within a colony change. The bees themselves change physiologically to be able to swarm and to be able to produce wax. And it's reasonable to assume that the Tropilaelaps mites pick up on those cues in some way, and they themselves are able to prepare in some way to be able to leave with that swarm, because they know that that colony is going to be broodless fairly shortly when, or certainly just have sealed brood, when that colony swarms. But with an artificial swarm, it's artificial. The beekeeper picks a point in time, the colony has no intention of swarming, it's just imposed on the colony. So therefore the Tropilaelaps mites have no sort of way to kind of prepare for that. And also the makeup of bees is older, so you've got older bees in the artificial swarm and younger bees in the natural swarm. So it's one of those differences. We need to do more work and look into this, but it's one of those sort of different physiological changes that's allowing Tropilaelaps to survive and be transmitted during swarming. So to kind of recap, so how can Tropilaelaps be transmitted? Well, swarms certainly on a local scale pose a risk and pose a threat, but then when we're having reports coming out of the United States and the UK of, so not just Apis mellifera, but other bee species turning up on shipping containers and aeroplanes, they do pose a risk. Bee sales pose a risk, so you have young bees in queen cages and packages. Tropilaelaps can survive for up to 5 days on those, and there's nothing to say that there won't be dead bees in those bee cells as well. So with Tropilaelaps surviving for up to 8 days on the dead bees. And then use beekeeping equipment. So it's inevitable that you've probably got some dead bee or an old comb with some dead brood within it. And currently in the UK, there's no legislation that stops the importation of used beekeeping equipment. It doesn't have to be sterilised before it's brought into the UK. So that poses a risk as well. Potentially somebody in Ukraine, Poland, Greece, wherever can pack up their beekeeping thing, not actually bring any live bees, but drive to the UK, and there is the potential that Tropilaelaps could be in those that equipment, which sort of takes us to imports. So this area here, so we've got Krasnodar and Rostov regions of Russia and Georgia. So these Tropilaelaps was confirmed there in 2024, and then we've got Crimea and Belarus with the unconfirmed reports in 2025. And these areas are bordered by two of the largest beekeeping countries in the world behind China. So we've got China that's number 1, we've got Turkey that's number 2, so 6.6 million registered colonies in Turkey. They have a very long tradition of migratory beekeeping. They'll migrate bees from the east right the way across the west every year and then back again. We also have Ukraine, so obviously with the war going on in Ukraine, it's a bit difficult to get kind of facts and figures, but in 2020, I think there was 2.3 million registered colonies in Ukraine, thought to be about half the actual number of colonies that are in Ukraine. And this shows the number of queens that we directly imported from those countries to the UK, so that the National Bee Unit has a live import tracker, which you can sort of check and see what's been inspected. Some really good news is that probably about 3 weeks ago, the UK actually banned the importation of queens from Ukraine because Ukraine cannot currently establish a Tropilaelaps free status. So that's good. But, like I said, we have other countries around the area which we are importing queens from. The other concern is that this doesn't kind of cover the queens and package bees that enter mainland UK via the Southern Ireland, Northern Ireland route. So Southern Ireland is part of the EU. Queens and bees can be moved to Southern Ireland. They can then be moved across the border to Northern Ireland, and then technically they're in GB, so they can enter mainland UK. And currently there's very limited inspection services. Most countries are really struggling with actually having feet on the ground to do health inspections, and that's really concerning. And I think the thing that worries me is that there isn't that traceability. So there's no kind of paperwork. If Tropilaelaps turns up and it's come in via this way, we've got no way to know how many queens were in this importation, and have we got them all? Have they gone all over the country? Have they gone to one place? So that's concerning as well. And finally, so I was in the summer, I was right down here in Georgia on the Turkish border. I could see Turkey. I was working on colonies that were infested with Tropilaelaps. If Turkey doesn't have Tropilaelaps at the moment, it probably will do very quickly. Like I said, they do this migratory beekeeping. Once it gets into the Mediterranean, the climate there is perfect for them. They're going to have a grand old time along the Mediterranean. But they seem to be doing quite well this way anyway, even though it's colder. So this is a long way away, but it's not actually that far away, so we do need to be concerned. So a bit of a history lesson now. So Norman Carrick, very kindly, I watched one of his presentations, and he had these clippings on what happened when Varroa arrived in the UK. And so for those of you that don't know, Torbay Beekeepers Association, it was the 4th of April 1992. They decided to train their beekeepers on how to find Varroa. and one of the beekeepers found Varroa. So, and the chairman of the association kind of confirmed it was Varroa, and then they notified the National Bee Unit, and then Varroa was in the UK. Because Norman sent me these, so I kind of went through them and I was reading them. So, and I've pulled out a few bits. So, this is written by Medwin Bew from the National Bee Unit, and he talks about how terrible Varroa will be when it gets to the UK, because he's writing it at the point when Varroa wasn't in the UK, how serious it will be, how inadequate the current checks are for the UK, and how it could spread within the UK when it gets here. And he's saying that the UK needs to talk to the EU or whoever they were at that point to bring in legislation to protect the UK from Varroa. But the editor of the BBK News clearly didn't have a sense of irony, because right next door to it is Varroa has just been found in the UK. And then poor old Medwin, so this is taken from Beecraft 1992. He obviously had his weekend ruined because he got phoned and said, oh wait, there's Varroa down in Torbay, get yourself down there. He drove down there on the Sunday, realised that it was Varroa, got some of his other bee inspectors to come out, and they quickly realised that it wasn't just this one association apiary, it was more widespread in that area. By 1992, Medwin had changed his name to Murray, so I think he probably got fed up with like answering the phone about Varroa at this point. And he was saying that he thought that Varroa had been undetected in the UK for at least a year, and that it was probably widespread. He was right, because by October 1992, we've got stop press Varroa found in Lincolnshire, which is a really long way away from Devon. And then finally, by January 1992, we have the chairman of the Bee Farmers Association talking about complete colony collapse, how they've had a terrible few years dealing with it. And this comes from a larger article which talks about fruit pollination in the southeast and how they are struggling to get their crops pollinated. So certainly that initial incursion of Varroa had a big effect. Lots of colonies were lost, and it caused a lot of trouble. And I think that probably Medwin and I have had some very similar conversations in our time. But I think the situation we're in now is that, you know, Tropilaelaps is not in the UK, so we have this window of time to deal with things. So what can you do as beekeepers? And this is something that, you know, I'm sort of very keen that we can kind of promote. So first thing to do is to educate yourself, so know what you might see in your beehives. So I've put some pests that you might see in a beehive here. So we have Varroa sinhi. So this is a parasite from Southeast Asia again. So these naturally infest those dwarf honeybee species. Not currently in the UK, you should not be seeing this in your beehives. However, Australia is currently having issues with this. It entered into Western Australia in 2023. They thought they'd eradicated it. They hadn't eradicated it, and they are now having issues with new strains of virus in their Apis mellifera colonies. So it's causing a few problems there. Varroa, which you have probably come across, I would imagine. And then we have C, which is mellifera, or the pollen mites. And you can see that C really is just a smaller version of D, which is Tropilaelaps. So it's thought that Tropilaelaps evolved from these pollen mites, and you can kind of see why, because it's just a bigger version. And then with E, we have Varroa cuica, or the bee louse. So this is actually a wingless fly. Doesn't do any harm to the colonies. They were very common pre-Varroa, but when people started using treatments, poor old Browler sort of took a bit of a hit. You tend to see them on the thorax of bees. They seem to like hanging out on queens quite a lot, but you are starting to see them more and more in UK hives. So 2023, myself and some colleagues, we did a piece of work, and that was to look at how the National Bee Unit bee inspectors did exotic pest surveillance and looked for Tropilaelaps, and we trialled all of these techniques. And some of them were very, very good, and some of them weren't very good, so we wrote a paper on that you can go and read. But like I said, that's kind of different to what beekeepers need to do, and it's going to be, I think that unfortunately with Tropilaelaps, the situation is going to be very similar, where it's a beekeeper finding Tropilaelaps and not necessarily a bee inspector. So how can beekeepers monitor? So brood uncapping, what can beekeepers do to monitor for Tropilaelaps. One of the ways of finding Tropilaelaps that is really effective is actually looking in the brood. So Tropilaelaps spend the majority of their time in the sealed brood. So this was a technique that was developed in Georgia in sort of 2023, 2024, just right when Tropilaelaps was arriving there. Beekeepers there are using this to monitor it. So it uses wax hair removal depilation strips, so things like Vite. I'm sure you've all got them available in your cupboards. And as you can see, you apply it to, and this is you can see how nice the frame of brood was there, but it is infested with Tropilaelaps mites. So when I talk about you go through the colony looks healthy, this is the sort of thing that you see when you actually uncap that brood. So it's something that beekeepers can do. You can go and you can purchase some Vite, or other brands are available, and you can build this in to be a part of your day-to-day, well, maybe not day-to-day, but monthly beekeeping inspection, where you actually go and check for Tropilaelaps mites. I would recommend, so if the temperature is very, very hot, which is probably not going to happen in the UK, the wax can get a bit soft and it doesn't pull off those cappings. Similarly, if it's very, very cold, the wax gets a bit brittle. To keep them in your pocket, that's kind of a good temperature to do it at. And pull the strip off, and even if there are very minimal numbers of mites, I would say sit and watch the brood for a minute or two, and those Tropilaelaps mites will come out of the brood. And then we have an icing sugar roll of adult bees. So this is where you sample the adult bees and put them in a container with some icing sugar, roll the bees in that icing sugar, and it's the act of, so that the sugar clings to the bees will groom themselves, and it's that act of grooming and the fact that the sugar clogs up the mites that releases those phoretic mites, and you will be able to detect Tropilaelaps that way. So when we trialled this, we also trialled an alcohol wash and CO2 monitoring for Tropilaelaps. Unfortunately, it wasn't as effective as this icing sugar roll. We think that the Tropilaelaps mites are just too small to be dislodged, but like I said, when the bees groom themselves, it dislodges them. Then shake your sugar into a plastic bag. You can do all of the hives in an apiary in one go, and then you've got this bag of sugar that you can then take home. And then what you need to do, so you either need a very fine sieve, so 0.035 millimeters, because Tropilaelaps are very small. We purchased a special one. You can get them on like AliExpress and things like that. You can see it doesn't actually harm the bees as well, which is good. It's not killing those bees. So put your sugar sample in your sieve, wash it through. You can also use a fine white cloth and do the same, and you will see those mites in the sieve or in the cloth. So you can see they are very small. Use a hand lens there, and you'll see Varroa and hopefully not Tropilaelaps mites. So I was going to talk about 6 different methods of detection for Tropilaelaps. Don't have time because I'm going to run over anyway. But what we do have, so this is the Phytoscience website, and we've put together a series of educational films. So all of those detection techniques are covered by a film. We've also done videos on things like the symptoms of Tropilaelaps, their biology. We've just got another one about to come out on their reproduction. We try to put them out once a month on the website. Sometimes that slips a bit, we're away quite a lot doing research and stuff. But there's also free leaflets that people can access. So if you want to print something off and just have that, with your beekeeping equipment, it's got how to identify them and different detection techniques. All of the little videos that I use in this talk are on the website. You can use them for free. There's also webinars that have been recorded, and there are links there to that. And plus there's the actual sort of scientific research that we've written up into papers. So there's a kind of a broken down version of that research and access to the actual literature there. And I put stuff on social media as well that kind of links back to the website. It's all free. Please use it. I can't be the only person that talks about Tropilaelaps. You've got a winter of beekeeping events at your association. Please use this and raise awareness of Tropilaelaps. I think that's the best kind of hope that we have to be able to manage this if it gets to the UK. I'll put this up again at the end, so don't worry. Right, control. So I'll briefly go back over biology. So Like I said at the start, Tropilaelaps reproduce much more quickly than Varroa. The time it takes from an egg to develop into an adult is much shorter. Tropilaelaps can lay eggs more rapidly. But the main thing when it comes to control, and this is what beekeepers want to know about, is the phoretic phase. So Tropilaelaps have, the literature says, between 24 and 48 hours as a phoretic phase. Personally, I think actually that's much shorter than 24 hours. Tropilaelaps have no reason to be outside of that sealed brood. Why would you go somewhere that's dangerous when you can be sealed within a nice cell? I think once the bee emerges, and Dan and myself and Irakli and Jeff, we've all seen this, the mites will hop out of one cell and hop into another and potentially begin reproduction again. So Varroa have this 5 to 7 day phoretic phase because they need to feed on the adult bees to be able to produce eggs. So as Tropilaelaps has spread and as beekeepers have had to deal with it, they have generally employed the methods that are used for Varroa control to tackle Tropilaelaps. So here are kind of 4 of the common biotechnical control methods that are used for Varroa. So I'm just going to briefly cover how they work for Tropilaelaps control. So first we have drone brood removal, which is, so Varroa will preferentially infest drone brood, and it's quite a common practice to encourage your beehive to produce drone brood. You then remove that and that reduces the Varroa mites. Tropilaelaps don't preferentially infest drone brood, so this only has quite limited efficacy. The other issue is that you can only carry it out when the colony is actively producing drones, so spring, early summer. And the important thing is you must remember to remove that brood before it emerges out, because otherwise you're just breeding mites in your colony. Like if it's raining and your bees are about to emerge, you have to go in there and take it out. So secondly, we have brood removal or a shook swarm. So this is where all of the bees are shaken onto fresh foundation in a new hive, and that brood is taken away. So because Tropilaelaps have this short phoretic phase, the majority of mites will be sealed within that brood, and that means that you are taking away the majority of the mites. So it's very effective at removing a large number of mites, but you do need extra equipment. You do need to feed the bees so that they can produce that comb. The conditions have to be right, so the temperature has to be warm enough for the bees to produce the wax, and it will impact the colony. It reduces its size. You're taking away the brood. Potentially, it can impact your honey crop as well. So then we have queen caging. So queen caging is where you go in, you find the queen, you confine her to a small plastic cage, which means that she can't lay anymore and she can't produce brood. Typically you do it for about sort of 25 days over the summer. You can also do it over the winter. So again, without any brood, that reduces the Tropilaelaps reproduction. Also reduces the size of the colony. You do need to be careful because with queen caging, sometimes the colony will make emergency queen cells. So you do need to sort of check that they haven't gone into that emergency queen cell mode. And then finally, we have comb trapping. So again, go in the colony, find your queen, you put her on a frame of sort of empty brood frame, and then you put that frame in a frame cage. So the queen can only lay on that frame. That then becomes the only brood within the colony. All of the mites go into that brood. When it's sealed, and you have to remember to remove it when it's sealed, you take that out, you move the queen to a new empty frame and cage that again, so you have to do it several times. So it's slowly removing the brood and removing the mites, and again, that reduces the levels of Tropilaelaps in the colony. So all of these techniques work with sort of varying levels of success, but I think the main thing is that they all take quite a long time to complete. They're all quite labour intensive, and for Tropilaelaps, for it to be successful, you have to do it on all of the colonies in your apiary in one go. So if you've got 3 or 4 hives, that's probably not a problem, but if you're looking at sort of 80, 90 hives, it's very difficult to do this simultaneously on all your colonies. So what treatments? Chemical treatments are another option for beekeepers. And here we have chemical treatments from all over the world, and these are designed for Varroa control. And like I said, Varroa has this longer phoretic phase, and these treatments have been designed so that during that phoretic phase, the chemical So the active ingredient in those treatments comes into contact with the mite, and that's what kills it. And very often they require multiple treatments, and they can take sort of several weeks to apply. And they, with Tropilaelaps, with that short phoretic phase, there's a very short window of time for the actual active ingredients to come into contact with the mite. But formic acid, so these are all formic acid-based treatments. Formic acid is the only current treatment that will penetrate into the sealed brood cells and affect mites that are reproducing within the brood. So we've got various formic acid treatments here. So we looked at that this year. So we have 2 commercially available formic acid-based treatments. So we have Formic Pro, which is produced by Nord Global. It is a slow-release gel matrix with 46% formic acid, and you've got these 2 strips here that you put on the colony. That QR code will take you to Nord, their website, so you can find out all about Formic Pro. The second one is Muravinka. So Muravinka is a Russian formic acid treatment. It's commonly used in Georgia. It is this sort of like papery cloth bag. It's not very big, and when you cut one open, it's got these sort of like gel crystals inside it, and that uses 85% formic acid. So with one of these, you get about 20 grams of formic acid as a dose. With this, you get about 100 grams of 46% formic acid. So 2 quite different treatments there. So we did this in August in Senaki in Georgia, and one of the issues with any formic acid treatment is that if the temperature gets above 35 degrees Celsius, that's, really you shouldn't be using formic acid. And in Georgia at that time, the temperature can kind of reach as high as that. So typically the average temperature was around 30 degrees, but with Formic Pro, the instructions on the packet say that the ambient temperature shouldn't be above 29.5 degrees Celsius for the first 3 days of treatment. So I spoke to Nord and I sort of said, look, we're going to do this. What do you recommend? Because the temperatures are going to be borderline. So their advice was put it on the colony at night when temperatures are lower. So at 1:30 a.m., the temperature was 27 degrees, and humidity was 94%. Yeah, very, very nice and relaxing after a long day in an apiary. So we put the treatments on at night, and you can see that, we've got 30 degrees, 29 degrees, but the humidity is very, very high in August. So we treated the colonies. We also looked at the colonies, so before we put any treatments on, we assessed the adult bee population. Here we are assessing the brood population, so we counted the number of 5 centimetre squares of open and sealed brood. We did that for every brood frame. We did it at the start, the middle and the end of the experiment. And then we checked the brood, so during the treatment and then at the end of the treatment, to see how many mites were alive, how many mites were dead. So for just this trial, we biopsied over 14,000 cells of brood. And this is I don't know, probably about 1-2 o'clock in the morning where we're biopsying brood. So we did a lot of brood biopsying for that. And what did we find? So, so initially when we set out in August, we just wanted to kill Tropilaelaps mites. Formic Pro, excellent in killing Tropilaelaps mites. So at 60 hours, so 2.5 days, over 97% of the Tropilaelaps mites were dead. And by day 5, so this increased to 99%, or over 99%, sorry. Muravinka, not so good, so at 60 hours, approximately 80% of the Tropilaelaps mites were dead, but then by day 5, that had increased to about 88%. And the good thing was there was no kind of negative effect on the colonies. However, neither were very good for Varroa control. So you can see that Formic Pro killed about 43% of the Varroa mites, and Muravinka killed about 20% of the Varroa mites, but we hadn't followed the manufacturer's instructions for use. We had just looked at it to kill Tropilaelaps mites. And we'd done what we set out to do, so we finished that experiment. Then we went away, we sort of sat down, we thought about it, and we thought, well, it's great, we've killed all the Tropilaelaps mites, fantastic, but that's not much use to beekeepers, because you've then got hives, okay, they don't have Tropilaelaps, but they've got a Varroa issue, and the beekeepers are going to have to do something else to deal with that Varroa infestation. And then the other thing we wanted to look at was obviously August. The ambient temperature and humidity was very, very high. We were right at the limits of what you should do with Formic. So we wanted to rerun it when the weather conditions were more similar to UK, European, North American things. So we redid it again in October because brood biopsying is so much fun. And we had very different results. So the temperature ranged from about 10 degrees at night. I think the highest it got to was 27 degrees. Around sort of mid to low 20s during most of the time. The biggest difference though was the ambient humidity, so it ranged from about 20% up to 99%, and when we first put the treatments on, the humidity was very low, so it was 20% humidity, and the colonies handled it very, very differently. So you can see here we put the formic treatments on and the bees are absolutely fanning like crazy to get that formic acid out because the humidity was lower, and you can see that on a few colonies we had quite a significant amount of dead bees from these formic treatments. But it killed a lot of mites. So by 60 hours, Formic Pro and Moravinca had killed over 99% of the Tropilaelaps mites. With Varroa, Formic Pro had killed 99% of Varroa, Moravinca had killed 97% of Varroa, so excellent. But we did have these issues with queen losses and with bee death. So we didn't stop there. So we wanted to kind of look at different strengths of acid, different methods of application, and different sort of durations of treatments, and that's kind of what you see here. So I haven't got data and graphs for it, but we had some very good results. We've managed to sort of increase that efficacy for mite killing without putting that sort of harsh kind of damage onto the bees. I'm sure I'll do more talks in the future, and I will present that. But I think the good news to take away is that we are refining the techniques, and formic acid does seem like a useful treatment. So to summarize, formic acid is very good at killing Tropilaelaps mites. It is dependent on the ambient temperature and the humidity. More work does need to be done, but I think if you've seen me talk before, I was sort of harbinger of doom, and everything's going to be terrible. We are getting these glimmers of hope in terms of treatment. Biotechnical control methods, so they do work, but this is a bit of a masterclass in how to find a queen. You need to be confident handling your bees, you need to be able to find the queens, you need to be able to handle them, and when you've got lots of colonies, it's going to be difficult to sort of actually manage to do these biotechnical control methods. So I think like the reality of Tropilaelaps is going to be this mix between biotechnical control and chemical treatments. But like I said, reinfestation is quite fast. So in August, we did one round of trials. We pretty much managed to get rid of all the Tropilaelaps in the apiary at that point, and we were very kind of smug and proud of ourselves. Irakli caged all of the queens in his apiary. He caged them for 3 weeks. But by the 1st of October, every colony was reinfested with Tropilaelaps mites, and a few of those colonies had quite high numbers, which was really shocking for me to see and quite depressing. So I think the reality for a beekeeper will be multiple treatments, and that will mean a lot of time and a lot of effort and potentially a lot of expense in terms of chemicals. So they are manageable, but it's not going to be simple. So finally, as Leslie said, myself, Alex Uzanov, Irakli Janeshai, and Marin Koviashi, we've written a book on Tropilaelaps. It covers biology, pathology, detection, control, basically everything that I've just sort of talked about in this talk, but lots more of it. My biggest thank you has to go to Irakli Janeshia and Dan Etheridge. So Irakli is a very modest guy. He's a very knowledgeable guy. He would never acknowledge this himself, and he'll probably hate me saying this, but I firmly believe that it is his knowledge. So he's a veterinarian. He's been a beekeeper since he was 12, and it's his kind of expertise and his passion that is pushing forward this research in Georgia. I firmly believe that we will sort out some sort of effective treatment that beekeepers can use that isn't too harsh on the bees, and it will be Irakli's ideas that kind of develop that in the future. We as beekeepers, whether we're in Europe, North America, we're very lucky to have him working on this. So a big thank you to Irakli. We use his colonies, he feeds us. So can't praise him highly enough. My other big thanks has to go to Dan Etheridge, who's sitting at the back, so you can give him a clap in a minute. So Dan's worked with me on this research since 2022. but I specifically want to thank him for the work he's done with regards to the recent sort of changes in legislation regarding queen imports. So Dan self-funded a trip to Georgia. Fire Science didn't have the funds for it at the time, and it was the knowledge and the information that he gathered there that he then fed back to the National Bee Unit. He fed it back to Defra Bee Health Policy. I firmly believe that the legislative changes wouldn't have happened without Dan just sort of quietly chipping away and pushing and saying, look, this is important, and giving them that knowledge. So Dan deserves a big thank you as well. Thank you, Dan. And then we have Jeff Wilson. So Jeff is the Saskatchewan provincial apiarist from Canada. Very nice guy, very knowledgeable guy. He's helped a lot with the treatment work. We've worked with him in Thailand, now in Georgia. The Fire Science team, so Paul Davies, George Tong, Kevin Pope, Avril Earle, they do a lot of work. They work incredibly hard. They have a lot of really good ideas. They're all beekeepers. They don't get a lot of recognition for it. It's always me up here sort of doing these talks. So thank you to those guys. None of them get paid for this work. Me and Dan don't get paid for this work. So, you know, we leave our children and families and we do this because we're passionate about it. So thank you to them. Dr. Badri Chutung, so she is the head of the Bee Lab at Chiang Mai University. She always hosts us. She sorts out colonies for us. She's just wonderful. Thank you to Bom. And then we have Alex Ozanov, Marin Koviashi and Celia Costas. So they've helped with some of the work in Georgia there. And again, a big, big thank you to everybody that funds this research. So we don't get any government money for this, and it is, you know, Bee Disease Insurance have funded this from the start, but there's also other contributors there that have funded Fire Science. It really is research that's funded by beekeepers for beekeepers. We're all really passionate about it, and we couldn't do it without the funding and the equipment and things like that. So big thank you to everybody that supported that. It's really important. And there's the website. And any questions?
You talked about the prevention almost better than a cure, and the changes in legislation that obviously Dan's work's done. Sort of a logical extension of that is just a ban on bee imports from any of those countries down in the southern Mediterranean. Fine if we have imports from Scandinavia, which is at the moment fairly free, but at least any of these countries at risk we just ban imports from. Surely that's the simplest method, because then that would reduce the chances.
So yes, you're absolutely right, but you also kind of have to look at the bigger picture there. So these queen imports come because there is a market for queens. So people would not buy these queens if beekeepers like you weren't purchasing them. And you know, lots of people make a lot of noise about we should ban imports. Personally, I think yes, we should, but we should also look at ourselves as beekeepers. You know, there is nothing to stop you as beekeepers producing extra queens. We can all learn the skills. We can all do that. We can all selectively breed from our own colonies, whether that's on an individual level or on an association level. So I've kind of scaled back my beekeeping a bit to do this work, but sort of 5-6 years ago, I would rear my own queens, and I would rear an extra 50 queens, and I would cherry pick the best queens from that, and then with the spare ones, I would go on Facebook to my local groups and I go, hey, I've got 20 queens, who wants a queen? I guarantee you, if you put that on Facebook and say, I've got a queen, you will be inundated with messages. And that's 20 queens that weren't purchased from abroad and weren't imported. You can do it on an association level, you can do it on a local level. If you guys aren't part of the solution, you are part of the problem. So yes, there is this kind of wider discussion around imports, but you know, if you can produce 50 queens, if you can produce 100 queens, put them on Facebook. If I had lots spare, I'd charge a £5 for postage because, you know, I had to drive to the post office. I guarantee you people will take those queens, and those are queens that aren't being imported from abroad. So, and I think we've become a bit lazy as beekeepers. We can open up our phone. I can probably order a queen tomorrow and it will turn up on Tuesday or Wednesday. I don't learn anything from that. It doesn't necessarily improve my bees or my stocks. So we all need to kind of take a look at ourselves and look at the way that we beekeep. But I mean, yes, we could ban imports, and that's potentially part of the solution. But there's other stuff that on an individual level that you can do. You know, let's do some queen rearing next year, and let's sort that out.
Just introducing myself, I'm Luke, and from November I'll be Vice Chair of the Bee Farmers Association, so this was really exciting for me to listen to and learn a little bit more about Tropilaelaps. But at the moment, I think it's quite concerning for me coming into this bee farmer role as to how much there's not really a discussion with the BBK, bee farmers, and linking up, and I think there's a lot more work that we can do together on that to actually address the issues around imports. And as a UK queen rearer, it was surprising we were prohibited from going to the Spring Convention because there's no promotion of UK queens. So just to echo what you're saying about the ease of people going online and buying queens and not really knowing what's going on with imported queens, and that is a huge risk. But I do think there's space for the UK queen producing sector, which is only doing about 5,000 queens commercially at the moment, to actually take up some of the slack of this 30,000 queens that are coming in. Yeah. But it's, everybody working together to try to realise that Tropilaelaps is the enemy, and we need to try to reduce the risk of this coming, and we're, prepared to work together to try and make this happen.
And yeah, thank you, and I agree. And I think whilst we kind of argue amongst ourselves, we're not actually achieving anything. And I think beekeepers, a bit of due diligence. If you're purchasing a queen, you need to kind of ask those questions of, where has it come from? What are the origins of it? There's some very nice glossy websites out there, but you do need to dig a bit deeper. And the UK can produce queens. So I come from Wales. I was a bee inspector for 10 years. In my area, there was a queen breeder called Ricky Wilson. Unfortunately, he passed away during COVID, but he was in his 80s when he passed away. He looked like he was about 60, but I was always shocked how old he was. And he produced queens in Ceredigion in Wales, which, if you were looking on the UK map, where shall I set up as a queen breeder? It's probably the worst place in the country, it's West Wales. And he would breed queens for bee farmers. He would always sort of have them available, and he had those skills and he had that knowledge. So people that say you can't do it in the UK, you can do it in the UK. It's harder than just going on the internet and buying one. But I think, we should be refining our skills and improving our beekeeping. And I always take great passion in learning these things. And I would produce queens, and some of them would be a bit rubbish, and I'd give those to people. No, I didn't, not really. I'm joking. I would produce queens, and I take passion in going like, yeah, they're really good, they're not so good. I was joking. And and I think we, as beekeepers, we should all do that. So.